guys get an advantage. At least you heard some of this stuff. I will back up to the brain and start talking there. At the end of today's session, we'll review what I didn't record so that you can at least make a note of that. So when we talk about the brain, we're going to divide the brain into sections that are separating their functions as well as, to some degree, their structures. So we start with a pair of cerebral hemispheres. A single one is called a cerebrum, and we're going to label those regions by the lobes that are most closely associated with these bones of the skull. Then we get to the diencephalon. Areas in the diencephalon that we're going to talk about include the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Then when we move to the brainstem, midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. And then finally, the last segment that we're going to talk about that's associated with the brain specifically is the cerebellum. And that literally means little cerebrum. So it's going to have some things that are similar in appearance, but a group of neurons with a completely different set of responsibilities. Okay, so what we're going to do then is we're going to start by looking at the cerebral hemispheres. And when we look at the brain and we talk about those regions that we've just been discussing, we can think of it a little bit like a mushroom. So sitting over top of the entire structure is the cerebral hemisphere. In this picture, this is anterior and this is posterior. So are we looking at the left cerebrum or are we looking at the right?
Left. The left.
Correct. Yay, everybody's got their orientation. Good. So the mushroom cap would be made up of the right and left cerebrum. And then the post that the mushroom sits on top of, the cap of the mushroom sits on top of, is basically the brainstem. So the pons, midbrain, pons, and medulla. And then sitting on the top of that is the thalamus, and just below the thalamus is the hypothalamus. So those are the regions that we listed on the previous slide. And then sitting back in here would be the cerebellum. So we're going to start by looking at the cerebral hemispheres. So we're going to draw out our cerebral hemisphere so it looks something like that. Okay, so this is our left cerebral hemisphere, and we can see that it's got raised and indented regions that we talked about when we talked about the layers. If we talked that the pia mater would be right against, and then we had our arachnoid matter. I can't remember what colors we used. Oh, I think we used green, didn't we? And we had our arachnoid matter with the extensions that separate it from the pia so that we could have cerebral spinal fluid in here. And then we had our dura matter that was a tough, whoops, that's not the color we used. Outermost layer that had a dural sinus that showed up periodically, which was where our cerebral spinal fluid could escape back to the circulatory system to be replenished. So the dura mater in the brain has some connections to bones of the skull, as well as connections to the underlying arachnoid matter. It's really a two-layered structure in the brain area and just a single layer of dura in the spinal cord. It's a little bit different in the spinal cord than in the brain. But otherwise, that's the protective layers. And then we had the skull sitting outside that we knew was made of flat bone, which was compact and spongy, and then compact bone, protecting the outside of the skull. When we look at this left cerebral hemisphere, so let's keep our orientation, the raised areas is called a gyrus, and the indented are called a sulcus, and deep indents are called fissures. So this area right in here is a very deep indentation, goes deep into the center of the cerebrum, so that's called a transverse fissure. If we looked at the top of this skull, well, the top of the brain, I should say, it would look a little bit, I made it a little bit too skinny, but you get the idea. And we'll keep the anterior there and the posterior here, convenience. But there's a longitudinal fissure, a very deep indentation that actually separates the right and left hemispheres from each other, except in the very center part. This region that I kept solid is a region of fibers that cross from right to left and back again, so that the right side of the brain knows what the left side of the brain is doing. That's a connection between the two cerebral hemispheres that's called the corpus callosum. Otherwise, those hemispheres remain separate from one another, the two sides, the right and left cerebral hemispheres. So then we have this, what's called a sulcus here, that's kind of right smack in the middle. So it's simply called the central sulcus. So it becomes a reference point for us. And we can generally, not perfectly, but we can generally indicate that on the behind this central sulcus, we're going to see a lot of nuclei that are associated with sensory function. And in front of that central nucleus or sulcus, we're going to see a lot of nuclei that have motor responsibilities. So even up in the brain, even in the cerebral cortex, we've got sensory and motor responsibilities. And this is a major site, this cerebral hemisphere, major site for conscious decision making. So a lot of the neurons are going to be involved with conscious functions in the body. So the motor neurons from up here will signal skeletal muscles to contract. And when we perceive pain, it'll be when the signal reaches this cerebral cortex. So these cortical functions are often, that word cortical is often in reference to conscious, but not always, conscious integration, voluntary integration. And a lot of our unconscious or subconscious integration is going to come from other neurons deeper in the central nervous system, those ones we mentioned like the brainstem and the diencephalon. So we use our central sulcus as a reference point. And the group of neurons that are found immediately behind the central sulcus, okay, there's posterior, so we know behind is going to be this area, and I'm going to color code it. Because this was a sulcus, The gyrus immediately behind would be called the post-central gyrus. And more importantly than remembering that, the post-central gyrus is the location for neurons that are responsible for somatic sense. So this area is called the primary somatosensory area. Primary somatosensory area. Remember earlier today I said if it has that word soma in it, it's body. So this is body sense. This is sensation that's coming from the body. In other words, external receptors. Pain, touch, temperature from the external environment. Receptors that are typically going to be found in the skin between the epidermis and the dermis. So we've got areas in the primary somatosensory area that are dedicated to the baby finger on the right hand. Remember, we're looking at the left cerebral cortex. So we've got groups of neurons that are going to be specific to sensation from the baby finger on the right hand. And then another group of neurons for the fourth digit on the right hand, third digit on the right hand, palm of the right hand, forearm, arm, shoulder. You follow me on this?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay, so when we talk about the primary somatosensory area, we describe it as being spatially organized. So what we're saying is these neurons here are receiving sensation for somatic stimuli like touch, temperature, and pain from specific locations. So there's a group of neurons that are going to be dedicated to the baby finger, to the fourth digit, to the third digit, to the hand, to the arm, to the trunk, to the leg. And you can reproduce the body in this primary somatosensory area based on the neurons that have spatial organization. So remember we said earlier today, the brain doesn't have pain receptors. So you can open up the skull and you can put electrodes on the brain and monitor electrical activity. So literally what we're saying here is if I squeeze the baby finger on the right hand, then we would see electrical activity in that part of the primary somatosensory area. If I went and I squeezed the knee, then we would see a different area light up in response to that group of neurons that are dedicated to that part of the body. So when I say that it's spatially organized, that's what I mean. Groups of neurons reproduce the sensation from specific parts of the body, that it's predictable and you can map it. So that takes care of a group of neurons that are responsible for somatic sensation. And we know somatic sensation is pain and temperature and touch from the skin, receptors in the skin, right? So now we have special sense. So, for example, in the occipital lobe area, we have the primary visual area. So if you had to take a wild guess, what sensation is the primary visual area going to be receiving?
Sight.
Yeah, sight, vision, light, dark colors. Okay, and in this region, right in kind of the junction between this lateral fissure and this central sulcus, we've got a group of neurons that are known as the primary auditory area. What do you think the sensation is that these neurons receive?
Hearing.
Yeah, hearing. Okay, now it gets a little tricky, but all the senses are represented. So it gets tricky because they just get deeper. Sort of deeper in behind this area would be the primary olfactory. What do you think the olfactory area receives? Well, think of the special senses. Which ones haven't we talked about so far?
Scent.
Smell.
Yeah, so yes, in this case, it's smell. Okay, and then deeper again, we would have the gustatory area. Gustatory area is for taste, and the vestibular area for balance. So they're all kind of clustered in that central area deeper down. We can't see them in our picture that we're drawing right here because the other ones overlap them a little bit. Now, in the case of sensation, all of these primaries, you notice that primary is part of the description in each of these sensations. So when it has primary in front of it, it means that the sensory information is raw data. So most of the time with raw data, we have to be able to process that and put some context to it. So nearby all of these primary areas, there are going to be what are called association areas. So for example, a group of neurons, and I'll just put crosshatch on these ones so we know it's a different area, is just going to be called the somato and I'm going to get rid of this for now. We don't need it. So it's called the somatosensory association. So association neurons are important neurons because they're going to receive the raw data for their responsibility, somatic sense in this case, and also receive data from other parts of the brain, such as our emotional brain and our memories and our past experiences and our centers for higher sort of what they call executive functioning, in order to put some context. So our neurons here are going to integrate somatic sense raw data and memory to give us context. So sometimes with somatic sense, it's hard to appreciate context, what we mean by that. But the one example that I use that helps, I think, a little bit is if you're in the hallways at Seneca College and you're in a crowded hallway and somebody comes up behind you and they grab your shoulder. Okay, so that's touch, right? They grab your shoulder. And you were expecting your friend to come up behind you because you saw them earlier in the hallway or whatever the circumstance was. So when that shoulder gets grabbed, you put context to the touch. Oh, that's got to be my friend because they said they were going to meet me in the hallway, and it's a friend, so I'm happy to meet them, and I'm glad for the touch. Okay? Or you're going down the hallway and you're on your own and you're thinking about your next class and you weren't expecting to meet a friend, and somebody grabs your shoulder and you're shocked, you're surprised, and you turn around with an angry look on your face. That's context. In both cases, the touch could be exactly the same, but your context was different. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm trying to say there?
Yes.
Okay. Now, with visual, I can show you a visual that I think helps with this as well. So we have our primary visual area, and the group of neurons that are nearest it would be called what? What would we call those group of neurons?
Visual association?
Yeah, visual association area. So we know that the visual association area is responsible for context. It's going to put memory and emotion and learning against the raw data. So here's a good illustration, or at least I think it's a good illustration. You may disagree with me. We'll see. So here we have a hill on the horizon. And on that horizon, there's a tree. Okay? Hopefully we can all agree that looks like a tree. But it's on the horizon. It's out in the distance. So I'm telling you there's a tree out in the distance. And then I have two people in the classroom take a look at that tree. And the one person lives up in the Arctic Circle. And up in the Arctic Circle, trees don't grow any taller than about 3 or 4 feet in height. But out on the West Coast, those trees can grow 200 feet tall. So two people are looking at this tree. One person makes a statement that says that tree's probably 150 feet tall. And the second person, the person from the Arctic Circle, says, "Are you kidding me? Trees don't grow that tall. That's going to be a 4-foot tall tree at the most." We're both looking at the same raw data. We can see a tree on a horizon, but there's no other points of reference. So that's why two different people that draw on two different sets of experiences will come up with a different height. You follow me so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So how do we fix that problem? Let's put in a point of reference. Let's put in a ladder. So now I tell you that this ladder is 10 feet tall. So if I tell you the ladder is 10 feet tall and we look at this tree, the tree's a bit taller than that. Let's say we agree that it's a bit taller than a 10-foot tree. It's maybe about 12 feet tall, right? We can both agree on it being taller than 10 feet because we can see that it's taller than a 10-foot ladder. Now we both have a point of reference that we both can relate to that allows us to agree on the size of that tree. That's the role for the association area of any of these primary sensations that we're talking about. Right? Now, if two people were sitting in a room and one was a bad guy and one was a good guy, and they heard a siren, the prime auditory area hears the raw data for a siren. The bad guy says, uh-oh, I got to get out of here. I'm going to be in trouble if I get caught. The good guy says, well, thank goodness the people running that siren are coming because they're going to save the day. You know what I'm trying to say there. If it's the police or if it's a fire department, we think about good things if we don't have anything to worry about. But if we're bad, we may think about bad things, but we're hearing the same raw data. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
So it means our response is different, right?
Yeah, and our response will be different based on our own personal experiences and our own emotions, right? So what it really means is that, you know, deeper down in the brain tissue, we've got memories and emotions, and those will be being sent to this association area along with the information of raw data, and we're going to integrate that. We're going to compare the raw data to our past experiences and our current emotions, and we're going to come up with an appropriate response. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So a group of neurons that are around the auditory area would be the auditory. So we're going to have association areas for all of our primary sensations. So when we look at association areas, they receive input to get our response. So our primary areas might be somatosensory, visual, auditory, olfactory, gustatory, which is taste, You can imagine what happens with taste and emotion and memory and so on. You know, sometimes you got a bad memory with a food, you never want to eat that food again. And vestibular. So remember, vestibular was a fancy word for balance. So those are all your senses accounted for. So there's a primary for all of these sensations, and there's going to be an association area associated with each, specific to each, with a similar responsibility, integration of emotion, memory, and learning that's going to give each of us our unique response to sometimes the same primary data. Now, if we go to in front of our central sulcus, we've got a pre-central gyrus. And our pre-central gyrus is this area right here. Now I can get rid of some of this just to make some space. And our pre-central gyrus is a group of neurons that are called the primary motor cortex. So the primary somatosensory area was the last place in the sensory pathway before we get to integration and starting to form a response. The primary motor cortex is the first place that we're going to generate a motor response from in the brain. In other words, so the primary somatosensory was the last place to receive a signal of sensation, and the primary motor cortex is going to initiate our descending pathway. The primary motor cortex is spatially arranged just like our primary somatosensory area was. In other words, there's a group of neurons in this area, for example, that are responsible for the muscles of the fifth digit in the right hand. And another group of neurons responsible for muscles to the thumb. And another group of neurons responsible to muscles of the forearm. Different ones for the extensors than for the flexors. And so on and so on and so on. So the primary motor cortex is also spatially organized. The primary motor cortex so what we're saying there is it's got dedicated neurons. Whoops. To specific parts of the body. That's not what that really means, specific muscles. In parts of the body. So we've got the word motor in there, so no longer sensory. And we don't need association areas here because this is part of our planning for a response. We're not receiving and trying to react. We're now planning a motor response. But we do need to plan. So we have a group of neurons near the primary motor cortex, and I'll show you where in just a minute, but we'll list them first. Premotor cortex. And the premotor cortex is responsible for the planning and will signal the primary motor cortex for the final pathway. So in our picture here, we've got a group of neurons. We'll change the color just a little bit. Kind of in this area right here, that would be the premotor. Cortex. And then right up in the front here, let's give it a different color. That's called the prefrontal. So remember we said that the lobes of the cerebral hemisphere are named for the bones that they're closely associated with. The visual area is occipital. Everything in here would be parietal. Down in here would be temporal. Up front here would be frontal because of the bones that are located. That's where those names come from. It's pretty simple as far as that part goes. But we're talking about the very, very front part of the cerebral cortex is called the prefrontal. So even in theory, it's even before or in front of the frontal, prefrontal cortex. But the prefrontal cortex is what we call, is dedicated to what we call intellectual or higher intellect functions. So that's where their initial planning, guys that were famous for inventions probably had a really, really well-developed prefrontal cortex. Animals don't have much of a prefrontal cortex because animals mostly survive by reacting to their environment. If they're cold, they're going to go try to get warm somewhere. If they're warm, they're going to go find some shade and slow down and cool off. If they're hungry, they're going to go find food. If they're mad, they're going to growl and attack. There's not much higher intellect functioning that goes on. But human beings can create initial ideas and come up with new and novel sort of thinking, right? That's how we discovered fire and made a round wheel and that sort of thing. So when we talk about the prefrontal cortex, what happened there? So all of these things that we're listing here are higher, or the term that you'll sometimes see with respect to the prefrontal cortex is executive functioning. So in other words, more complex thoughts and recognizing consequence for actions, that's a big one. And you women out there are going to know this for a fact. And boys in particular do not develop their prefrontal cortex sometimes until they're as old as 25 or 26 years of age. And you girls develop your prefrontal cortex much earlier than that, maybe 18 or 19 years of age. And really what that boils down to is you recognize that there's consequence for your actions much earlier than boys do. And if you don't believe me, look at the insurance companies and who they will rent a car to. They won't rent a car to a boy till he's 25 or older in many, many cases. And girls can often rent a car at a younger age. So if you don't believe the the anatomy and physiology of it, you can believe the insurance companies because they don't want to pay for car accidents. Boys will drive a car at 100 kilometers an hour around a corner that's supposed to be driven at 50 because they don't recognize, and I'm exaggerating here, they don't recognize that there's going to be a consequence for trying to take the corner at that kind of speed. Right? So that's what we're talking about there. But with respect to motor, we can sort of look at these three components to planning a motor response as a ready, set, go. So when we're planning a motor response, we've got to get ready, then we've got to get set, and then we've got to get go. So in the brain, in the cerebral cortex, the prefrontal is where we get ready. This is where we're going to decide that we're going to reach out and pick up that pen that's on that table about 3 feet in front of us. And the planning, the sequencing of the events is going to be premotor. And then go is primary motor. So when we're looking here, let's get a color that's going to show up. Ready. That didn't come out. Ready. Set. Go. And all we're saying there is from go, we're going to descend out of the cerebral cortex into the spinal cord and onto skeletal muscle. That's the go. Do you follow me on that?
Yes.
Sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Okay, so we're on the motor side right now, right? So if we've received sensory information that says, you know, that tack is in our thumb and we want to remove it, we've got to set up a motor plan. Maybe we're going to take our left hand and reach out and grab that tack and pull it out of our hand more than just withdraw, which would be more or less a reflex. So if it required a more complex response, the prefrontal cortex is going to tell us that we got to get rid of that tack. It hurts and we've got to act quick, ready. Set is sending the signals over. So we're going to relay over from the ready group of nuclei to the premotor group, and the premotor group is going to sequence the events. We don't want to squeeze our thumb and forefinger before we grab the tack, so we have to coordinate, and that's the premotor cortex's responsibility. And then from there, we're going to send over to the primary motor cortex to the specific groups of neurons that finish on the specific muscles of the body part that we want to move. Ready, set, go. Ready, set, go. Prefrontal, premotor, primary motor. So if we wanted to follow that up, we would go synapse, synapse, synapse. Then we would leave to the spinal cord and out to the skeletal muscles. That's our motor response. That would be from integration, descending to effectors. Ready, set, go, descending to skeletal muscle. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah? Do you need...
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I hear some hesitation. I don't know if that's just because we've covered a lot of stuff today.
It's more like the last part where we were talking about the motor and then the a lot of information, but it's still kind of like hard to process it.
Yeah. So you're going to want to review it. You're going to read through your PowerPoints and your textbook to support the stuff we're talking about here. But again, like always, don't go into crazy detail in the textbook if we haven't gone into crazy detail here. I'm only going to ask you questions like, give me a responsibility for the premotor cortex, right? I'm not going to ask you to give me all kinds of crazy details. So you just want to be able to discuss some of these areas that we've been drawing. If we don't draw them, I'm probably not going to ask you any questions about them, right? If we haven't talked about them, there's not likely to be any questions on it. But I mean, we've got quite a bit drawn in here as it is. We don't need to bog you down with more. Okay, now I just want to finish up with 2 more areas in the left hemisphere, and then we'll be done. Okay, and these are areas associated with speech. So, and they're typically found in the left hemisphere only, the one we're looking at here. So we have an area right behind the primary auditory area. And another area that's right in front of it. And you can appreciate that it's, or you want to be consistent here and consider that if it's in front, it's in the motor area, and if it's behind, it's in the sensory area, and this will stay consistent for us. So in this case, this is called Wernicke's. Unfortunately, it's a guy's name sticks with it. It is called Wernicke's area for speech. And this segment in front there is Broca's area for speech. So Wernicke's area for speech is responsible for putting context to speech. So that makes sense. If it's on the sensory side, we're going to hear the speech, and the Wernicke neurons will determine, for example, that person is speaking English, or that person is speaking Mandarin, or Spanish, whatever the case may be. But the Wernicke's area is the area that puts context to the sounds coming out of that other person's mouth. So it's like the sensation of speech, right? So you're going to be able to, so that's the Wernicke's area, the area that was behind and close to the auditory area. It also makes sense it would be close to auditory because you have to hear the sounds in order to put some context to the language. So it's putting context to the language. It might take some inputs from the emotion, so you can tell that the person's angry or excited or that sort of thing as well, right? Whereas Broca's area for speech is motor. So the neurons in this area are the neurons that are going to finish on muscles that help us pronounce and say things with emphasis or with clarity. Broca's area is motor for so the primary motor area typically finishes on skeletal muscles in the trunk or in the upper limb or the lower limb. Broca's area is like the primary motor, except it's going to finish on the muscles that we use for talking. So those two purple are Wernicke's area for speech, context for the sounds that people are making, and we can detect a language difference or maybe an emotional difference to the way they're speaking. And Broca's area is motor for speech. So those neurons will finish on muscles that are going to help us with speaking clearly and properly. We okay with that?
Yeah, that's it. That's okay.
Okay. So I think that's enough for today.